The farmhouse had been sealed for 32 years, every window bolted shut, every door reinforced with steel, a solar panel on the roof running just enough power to keep one cassette player alive, loaded, waiting, for whoever came through that door first. She came through it on a Tuesday in October. Inside, no furniture, no family photographs, no evidence that a person had ever chosen to exist comfortably here. Only filing cabinets, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, decades of careful handwriting, decades of numbers that were never meant to be found. And on a corkboard in the corner, a man's face circled in red marker, 3 words underneath. Her mother's handwriting, "He found us." She had been asking questions her whole life that nobody would answer. Now the answers were everywhere. And somewhere outside in the tree line, someone was already watching her read them. Have you ever found something in a family member's house that made you question everything you thought you knew about them? Not a scandal, not a betrayal, just a thing that didn't fit, a drawer that shouldn't exist, a name you'd never heard, a silence that suddenly had a shape. Hold on to that feeling, because what Jessica found inside that farmhouse wasn't just her mother's secret. It was her mother's entire other life, running parallel to theirs, for 31 years, and the woman who had spent 3 decades teaching 4th graders to read and write and ask questions had left her own answers buried under a New Hampshire hillside, sealed behind a steel door, waiting for the one person in the family who's too often stops. The lawyer's office on Trumbull Street in Hartford had the specific temperature of a building where the thermostat hadn't adjusted since October of some previous year, and nobody had found the moment to address it. 3rd floor, granite exterior, the kind of building that communicated permanence without warmth. Inside, the carpet was the color of old mustard, and the rubber plant in the corner near the window had that waxy stillness of something that had stopped growing and hadn't yet admitted it. Jeffrey Lewis sat behind a desk the approximate dimensions of a dining table for 6, his silver hair combed back in a center part that had not changed in decades, his reading glasses on a chain around his neck. 67 years old and built for exactly this room. The slight forward lean, the papers arranged by sequence, the measured pace of a man who had delivered difficult news to grieving families so many times that the delivery itself had become a kind of mercy. Jessica Davis sat across from him in the left chair, 31 years old, brown hair, the composed posture of someone who stood at the front of a classroom every day and could not afford to look uncertain. Her hands rested in her lap with a stillness that required active maintenance. 3 weeks since the phone call, 3 weeks since Sandra Anderson, 62 years old, had fallen forward in her garden in Meriden on a Thursday afternoon in late September and not gotten up again. Brain aneurysm. The neighbor found her at 7:15. The paramedics confirmed within minutes what the neighbor had already understood. No warning, no slow decline to prepare against. Just a Thursday afternoon and then a different world. Ryan Robinson sat in the right chair beside her. 35. Her brother by 4 years, broader across the shoulders from 15 years of electrical work, jaw set in the way it got when he was holding something carefully and didn't want to drop it. He'd driven down from New Haven that morning, and his coffee cup from the gas station on I-91 was still in his jacket pocket. He was tapping his left knee with 2 fingers. Not a song, not a nervous tick exactly. More like a calculation happening in rhythm. The estate reading had been straightforward. Life insurance, adequate for the funeral costs with a remainder. The house in Meriden, paid off completely. Split between Jessica Ryan in equal shares, no dispute. Savings account modest, no debts of any kind, nothing left unresolved. Sandra Anderson had been a woman who resolved things. Who replaced the water filter before it needed replacing and left the receipt in the designated drawer. Who renewed the car registration 3 weeks early and put the sticker in the glove compartment with a note that said exactly which slot it went in. 3 decades of keeping her household in functioning order without leaving anything to chance was exactly why the second folder felt wrong before Jeffrey Lewis even opened it. He reached across the desk, not hurrying, not hesitating, just moving with the careful momentum of someone completing a task they'd already decided how to complete. He opened the folder. Inside was a single heavy envelope and a folded piece of paper. "There's one additional property," he said. "Your mother kept it separate from the primary trust by specific written instruction. She added it to her file 5 years ago and asked that it be disclosed only at the time of estate reading." He slid the envelope across the desk. Jessica could see through the paper the irregular outline of an old key, the kind with a substantial shank and irregular teeth, not a modern cut. It's a farmhouse in rural New Hampshire, near a town called Dunmore, in the Monadnock region. Your mother purchased the property in 1992. 32 years ago, Ryan had stopped tapping. She left the property solely to Jessica. The note is addressed to both of you, but the deed transfers only to Jessica. He placed the folded paper on top of the envelope. Jessica reached across and took it. The handwriting stopped her for a moment, the way her mother's handwriting always did. That particular leaned to the right, the letters slightly compressed, as though there was always more to say than there was space for. The handwriting of report cards and grocery lists, and reminder notes on the refrigerator. The handwriting of 31 years of small daily evidence that her mother existed. Jessica, you were always the one who asked the questions I couldn't answer. Go to Dunmore. Bring Ryan, and only Ryan. Don't tell anyone else where you're going. Open the house. You'll understand why I had to be the way I was, and I hope you'll forgive me. She read it once, then again. Then a third time, not because the words were unclear, but because they didn't match anything she knew about the woman who'd written them. Her mother's note said, "Picked up your prescription. It's on the counter." Her mother's note said, "The gutters need cleaning before November. Number for the service is in the blue folder. Actionable, specific, present tense. Not retrospective, not apologetic. I hope you'll forgive me" was not the language of a woman who kept the gutters clean. It was the language of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally found a place to set it down. "Do you know anything about this property?" Jessica looked directly at Jeffrey Lewis as she asked it. She watched his face, one beat. A short pause, less than a second. "But distinct. Very little," he said. "Your mother didn't discuss it with me directly. I know only what the file contains." That pause. She noted it the way she noted things that didn't quite fit. Not accusation, not certainty. Just a data point, held apart from the others until the picture got clearer. Sandra Anderson had never mentioned New Hampshire. That was the thing Jessica turned over in the silence that followed, while Ryan drove the paperwork and the envelope and the iron key back through the process of signing and initialing. Not that she'd mentioned it occasionally and let it drop. Not that she'd referenced a property without detail. Never. Not once in 31 years of car trips and dinner conversations and the particular intimacy of two people living in a house together had Sandra Anderson said the word Dunmore, or described a farmhouse, or given any indication that she owned anything north of Hartford. She had been 7 years old when she asked her mother why there were no photographs of either of them before Jessica turned 4. Not the pointed question of a child building a case, just the genuine curiosity of a kid who had noticed that her friends' houses had albums going back to before the friends themselves existed. Her mother had said, "We lost everything in a move, before you were born. Boxes that didn't make it." Which boxes? All the ones with the photos. Why didn't you take more pictures after? Her mother had stood up and rinsed her coffee cup and said they should get to the grocery store before it got crowded, which was not an answer, which was a practiced non-answer, which Jessica had accepted at 7 because she didn't yet know that there was a category between answer and lie. The category of a thing that is technically possible, but that I am saying because you won't check. She was 8 when she asked about her grandparents, 15 when the man knocked on the door at 8:30 in the evening, and her mother had turned off the lights and stood in the dark until the footsteps left. 22 when she found, in a drawer of her mother's desk while searching for a stapler, a sealed envelope with a name on it that wasn't Sandra and an address that wasn't Merider, and had put it back without mentioning it because by then she'd understood that mentioning things produced the kind of non-answers she'd been collecting for 15 years, and the collection was sufficient. She had known, in the way that knowing accumulates from small evidences over time, that there was something. She had not known the shape of it. She had not known that the shape was this. The drive up I-89 took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Ryan's pickup smelled like sawdust and coffee, and the pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror that had long since stopped doing anything. The October trees along the highway were extraordinary, red and orange and yellow stacked against each other in a way that looked like a painting someone had been too enthusiastic about. Beautiful and cold. The kind of beautiful that comes with an expiration date. She never mentioned New Hampshire. Ryan kept his eyes on the road. Not one time, I know, 32 years. She bought this place the year before you were born and never said a word. The property taxes come out of an account I never knew existed, Jessica said, which means there was money somewhere separate from the household accounts. which means she was managing two financial lives simultaneously for at least 3 decades. Ryan was quiet for a long time after that. The kind of quiet that is actually very loud. The signal on their phones dropped to nothing after they turned off the main highway onto the county road. Not abruptly, it faded, the way light fades at the end of the day, incrementally until you suddenly noticed it was completely gone. The printed map Jeffrey Lewis had prepared showed only numbered county roads and a handwritten annotation at the last turn. Left at Fallen Oak, follow ruts to clearing, no street address, no GPS coordinates. A location designed to be found only by someone who already knew where it was. They stopped at a gas station on the county road before the last stretch. One pump, a small convenience store, a handwritten price on a whiteboard. The kind of infrastructure that survives in rural areas through sheer necessity. An older woman sat on a wooden chair outside the store's front door. 74, maybe 75. White hair in a tight knot at the back of her head. A dark green wool sweater with the specific pilling of something worn consistently for years. She watched them pull in with the unhurried attention of someone who had watched every vehicle come through this intersection for the last several decades, and had developed strong opinions about which ones were lost. Ryan went inside to pay. Jessica stood by the pump and checked the screenshot of the map she'd taken before the signal died. She was tracing the final turn with her finger when the woman spoke. "You're headed to the farm, not a question. An identification? We are?" Jessica kept her voice neutral. "How did you know?" "Only property down that road." A pause. "Carol's place." The word landed sideways. Jessica looked up fully. "Carol? Woman who bought it in 92. I saw her maybe 3 times total. She didn't come around much. Kept to herself." Another pause, shorter. "She had your eyes." Ryan came back out with 2 coffees and stopped when he saw Jessica's expression. "Did she ever say anything to you?" Jessica asked. "Leave anything?" The woman's gaze moved to the road and back. A measuring look, one thing only. She said if anyone came looking, tell them she was gone already. The tick of the cooling engine, the wind in the roadside pines. Carol, her mother's name was Sandra, had always been Sandra. For every year Jessica had been alive to know her by any name at all, except the woman sitting outside a gas station in Dunmore, New Hampshire, had met her 3 times in 32 years and called her Carol without hesitation. They got back in the truck. The woman on the chair watched them go without waving. Jessica held the coffee without drinking it. Something about the warmth of the cup in her hands and the cold outside the window was the only thing that felt real for the next 4 miles. The farm road was unpaved, single lane with grass growing in the center strip between the tire ruts, in the way that happens when a road is used infrequently enough for vegetation to reclaim the middle ground. The pickup bucked and shuddered over exposed roots and embedded stones. A branch knocked the roof hard enough to leave a sound, but Ryan didn't slow down, just set his jaw and kept going, because stopping would require reversing, and reversing on that road was this was its own problem. Then the trees thinned and the clearing opened. Jessica had been building a mental image for the last 3 hours, and the image her mind had settled on was a neglected vacation property. Weathered siding, sagging elements, the general air of something left to age without maintenance. A place you'd look at and think, this was once a plan that didn't work out. What she saw was not that. The farmhouse was 2 stories. Dark wood siding, not original but chosen to weather to a color that didn't draw the eye. Fieldstone foundation. The proportions were low and wide, a shape that didn't advertise height or space. Set back from the clearing edge, partially shadowed by the hemlock canopy even at midday. From a distance it looked almost unremarkable, almost like a barn that had been converted, which was probably the point. Up close, the windows were wrong. Every ground floor window had been covered with plywood. Not tacked up hastily, not the temporary boarding of a property closed for winter. Marine-grade plywood, the rating used for boat construction, bolted directly into the window frames through the exterior trim. The bolt heads were recessed and painted over. The edges were sealed with exterior caulk. Someone had stood at each window with a power drill and made certain that nothing was moving through this barrier without the right tools and the right time. Ryan, her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. He was already out of the truck, standing in the gravel that had mostly returned to dirt, looking at the front of the house, with the expression of someone running a structural assessment and arriving at unexpected numbers. "I see it." She was a retired schoolteacher. "I see it, Jessica." The front door was steel, not reinforced, not a wooden door with a steel core, actual plate steel, painted the same dark color as the siding. 2 deadbolts, heavy-duty residential grade. One padlock below the handle, iron, shackle thick as her index finger, the design of something meant to keep a shipping container secured rather than a house. The key from Jeffrey Lewis's envelope fit the padlock. The tumblers had developed resistance from long disuse, and it took Jessica 3 attempts before the shackle released, with a sound like a firearm being made ready. The first deadbolt required both of them. Ryan's hands over hers on the key, both of them leaning into the resistance until the mechanism finally turned. The second was stiff but manageable. When the door swung inward against the stone threshold, the sound had no give in it, no cushion. Pure mass. The air that came out was not musty in the ordinary way of closed spaces. It was something more concentrated, the specific density of a room where the oxygen had been stable and undisturbed for so long that it had developed its own character. Dry, heavy, the smell of paper oxidizing slowly in the dark, of wood that had stopped breathing decades ago. They stood on the threshold with their flashlights. Then they went in. No furniture, none whatsoever, not a chair, not a shelf, not a hook on the wall for a coat. The living room had been emptied of everything that would suggest it was a room where a person might choose to exist, and refilled with something else entirely, filing cabinets. Gray industrial metal, the kind used in offices where the storage needs are permanent and the aesthetic is irrelevant. They lined every wall, floor to near ceiling, stacked in places 2 units high. Some had small locks on the drawer handles. All of them were closed, dozens of them. Jessica counted along the left wall alone before she lost track. The sheer volume of storage implied a volume of documents that had no reasonable connection to the woman, who had taught reading comprehension at Meriden Elementary for 22 years. In the center of the room, one table. Scarred wood, heavy construction, the kind of table that had seen decades of use and showed every one of them. On the table, a cassette player, small and black and yellowed to ivory at the corners, and beside it, bolted to the wall through the baseboard, a small solar converter with a green indicator light burning steadily. A thin wire ran from the converter up the wall and through a half-inch hole in the ceiling plaster. The roof panel, powering just enough electricity to keep one device and one indicator alive. A tape was loaded in the cassette player. Visible through the plastic door, 6 words on the label, in handwriting Jessica recognized. Only when there is no other choice. She didn't press play. She took a picture of it with her phone. Still no signal, but the camera functioned, and filed it in the part of her mind that was cataloging things she didn't yet understand. Ryan was across the room, behind the last row of filing cabinets along the far wall, and the quality of his silence had changed. She crossed to him. The corkboard was floor to ceiling, 7 feet wide, mounted into the wall studs with hardware meant to hold substantial weight. It was covered, not partially, not in patches, entirely covered with newspaper clippings, black and white photographs, hand-drawn maps, and documents connected by lengths of red string pinned from point to point across the surface. The web was dense enough that following any individual line meant losing it in the crossing of others. The clippings were old enough to have gone brittle at the edges. The newsprint browned to a tone between yellow and tan. The photographs had the grain of images taken at range with equipment that prioritized distance over resolution. The maps showed the Maine coast and parts of New Hampshire, with locations ringed in the same red marker used on the string. Jessica leaned close and read headlines. Portland Harbor Commission opens internal review after missing cargo manifest surface. March 1988, federal grand jury convenes on New England port corruption allegations. February 1989, 2 found dead in Lewiston warehouse, cause ruled suspicious. November 1989, bank officer receives suspended sentence, claims he was operating under duress. October 1991, she was investigating something, Ryan said. Not a question. Trying the idea out, she was keeping records of something. Different thing. Possibly the same situation viewed from a different angle, or possibly an entirely different situation. And the difference mattered. In the upper right corner of the board, slightly apart from the dense cluster of clippings and photographs, a single image. A man somewhere between 40 and 50 in the photograph. Good suit, dark, jaw squared. Eyes set narrow under a heavy brow. The posture of someone comfortable with being the tallest authority in any room, not through physical size, but through the particular way authority arranges itself in a body over years. Around the man's face, someone had drawn a circle in red permanent marker. The circle was not precise. It had the pressure and slight wobble of a mark made by a hand that was not entirely steady. Made under some feeling, underneath, in the compressed rightward lean of her mother's handwriting, he found us. Not past tense, not resolved, present ongoing. 2 words with a pronoun that included someone other than the writer. Whatever the threat was, it did not belong to Sandra Anderson alone. Jessica photographed the board, the circle, the handwriting, the headlines in sequence. She photographed the man's face. Then she walked back to the filing cabinets. The drawers were labeled by year, and then by a letter code she didn't immediately recognize. She opened the first drawer of the leftmost cabinet. Accounting records, handwritten columns of figures. Not the neat formatting of a professional ledger, but the compressed practical notation of someone recording transactions that needed to be accurate but not beautiful. Account numbers written in abbreviated code. Dates from 1985. She opened the adjacent drawer. Same year, different accounts. More figures, the same handwriting, but here with margin annotations, asterisks, bracketed notations, question marks at certain entries. Someone checking their own work. Someone who had found discrepancies and was tracking them. She was the accountant. The thought arranged itself without drama. She kept the books. For whatever this was, she moved to the next cabinet. A different drawer yielded maps, detailed topographic reproductions of the Portland Harbor area, with handwritten additions, pier numbers, vessel names and arrival dates. 3 locations circled in the same red marker as the man's photograph on the corkboard, then a blue folder with no tab. Inside, letters not accounting records, not maps. Personal letters written on plain paper with a blue ballpoint pen that had occasionally run thin and been pressed harder to compensate. The handwriting was her mother's, recognizable immediately but different in quality. More deliberate, more careful, the way handwriting gets when the writer knows the words need to last. Each letter began the same way. Owen. She read the first one standing in front of the open drawer, her flashlight angled down. Owen. You'll never read these. I know that. I know where you are and I know you'll never see them. But I have to write them anyway because on the days when the weight of everything gets too heavy to carry, the only thing that helps is pretending there's someone on the other end of the sentence. She read the second letter, third, fourth, fifth 5 letters, dated between 1992 and 1997, written to a child who had been left behind, a child who would have been 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 during those years, a child learning to read while his mother wrote letters he would never receive and filed them in a locked cabinet in a sealed farmhouse under a false name she hadn't yet finished building. Owen. She put the letters in the inside pocket of her jacket, not as evidence, not as documentation. For the same reason she'd been filing things away since she was 7 years old, because they were real, and real things deserved to be held somewhere that wasn't a cabinet in an empty house. The second floor had 2 rooms. The first was bare. Plank floor under a solid 2 inches of undisturbed dust, 1 window bricked over from the inside, no evidence of any use. The second room, at the end of a short hallway, faced the direction of the forest. Inside, 1 iron folding cot, closed and latched against the wall, 1 wardrobe, the particular chill of a room that has had no heat source for a very long time, and the scratches on the floor, deep parallel lines in the hardwood, starting directly beneath the wardrobe's feet, extending toward the center of the room. Not from a single event. The marks had been worn down at the edges, the wood smoothed by repetition, the scratches of something moved many times over many years, back and forth, out and back. Ryan was already crouching near the center of the room, running a finger along a seam between floorboards that his electrician's eye had identified from the doorway. 3 boards in the center of the scratch pattern had no visible fasteners. He took his flathead screwdriver from his back pocket, the same one that had been there every day for 15 years, the wood handle worn to the shape of his grip, wedged it into the seam, and pressed. The boards came up with a crack that bounced off the low ceiling and came back twice. Below them, a hollow space between 2 floor joists, and in the hollow, an ammunition box. Military issue, olive drab, the paint worn to bare metal at the corners. The kind of box manufactured in the 1960s for storage of cartridges in conditions that included moisture and temperature extremes. Heavy. No lock, only a hinged latch. Ryan lifted it out and set it on the cot. The latch was cold. Jessica opened it herself. The money was along the bottom, stacked and organized in the specific way of someone who had once been trained to handle large amounts of currency and retained the habits. Bundled in groups, secured with paper currency straps, the straps printed with the name and routing information of First National Commercial Trust of New England. Dissolved in 1993, she counted the visible bundles. 14. The denominations were hundreds, at minimum $160,000. Possibly more. She did not touch the money. The leather travel pouch next to the money held 2 American passports and a Connecticut state identification card. She opened the first passport. The photograph inside showed a woman in her middle 20s, hair cut close and dyed dark, a deliberate reinvention of color and length. But above the altered hair, the eyes were unchanged. The specific set of them, level, measuring, guarded in a way that looked like composure until you knew her well enough to see it was vigilance. Eyes that had looked at Jessica across every breakfast table for 31 years. Carol Ann Voss. Issued 1986, the second passport. The same eyes, blonde hair this time longer. A different reconfiguration of the same woman, Lynn Braddock. Issued 1991, the state ID. Brown hair, the natural shade her mother had worn for as long as Jessica could remember, Sandra Anderson. Issued 1992, Hartford, Connecticut. 3 versions of the same person. 2 created to be discarded. 1 worn for 30 years until it became the only version her children ever knew. Ryan had gone very still beside her. At the bottom of the leather pouch, beneath the passports, a small velvet-covered box. Inside was not jewelry. A folded document on thick paper and a cassette tape, smaller than the one downstairs, with a matching label in matching handwriting. Only when there is no other choice. She set the cassette on the cot and unfolded the document. The paper had the weight and texture of official state records. The printing was clear despite the yellowing at the fold lines. Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Office of Vital Records. Certificate of live birth. She read the child's name, Brandon James Voss. Date of birth, August 14, 1987. Place of birth, Boston, Massachusetts. Mother, Carol Ann Voss. Father, George White. She read it again, 1987. 4 years before Ryan. 5 years before herself. A child born to Carol Ann Voss and George White in Boston in 1987, when her mother was still Carol, still in Boston, still keeping his books, recording his transactions, maintaining the columns of figures in the filing cabinets downstairs. Still apparently having his children, Ryan sat down on the edge of the iron cot. He didn't fall. He sat deliberately, as a person sits when they need the floor to stay where it is and the body to stay connected to it. "We have a brother," Jessica said, quietly, as a statement, not a discovery, because she was still processing the gap between those 2 states. She left a child. Ryan's voice had the quality of something being held flat. She had a child, and she walked away from him. She ran, not the same thing, and the difference was going to matter. She looked at the photograph on her phone of the man on the corkboard. The square jaw, the narrow set of his eyes under a heavy brow, the posture of authority, worn long enough to become involuntary. She knew that name. Not from her mother, not from any family conversation. From a local hoist project 3 years ago, a box of newspapers at the back of the school library. George White, Port Operations Manager. Convicted of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy in multiple federal proceedings. Final sentence, 22 years. Died in federal custody in 2023. Last year, George White was dead, and Sandra Anderson, Carol Ann Voss, had followed him by 14 months, and somewhere, a 37-year-old man named Brandon Voss had been watching both of those facts unfold, and had been waiting to see what happened to the farmhouse. But what nobody had ever told Jessica, in 31 years of ordinary life, was that she had an older brother. A brother her mother had walked away from when he was 2 years old. A brother who had been left with the man in the red circle. A brother who had been looking for this farmhouse for a very long time. The sound came from below, and there was no ambiguity about what it was. Iron against iron. The specific mechanical sound of a deadbolt engaging, not disengaging, moving into the locked position. From the outside, then footsteps on the gravel. Not running, not hurrying. The deliberate pace of someone completing a planned action and walking away from it with no urgency because the outcome was already secured. The footsteps faded. The trees absorbed them, then nothing. Ryan was at the stairs before the silence had finished settling. By the time Jessica reached the ground floor, he already had both hands on the steel door. Weight forward, pushing. The door did not move. It did not rattle in the frame or flex under pressure. It received his full weight and gave back exactly nothing, because it had been designed and installed and bolted to purpose by a woman who understood what it meant to need a door that held. He hit it with the flat of his palm. Once, twice, 3 times. Loud in the sealed house, going nowhere outside it. "Hey, there are people in here, open this door." The plywood over the windows blocked sight and muffled sound. The back door was bolted from within and, she could see it now, the exterior bolt housing on the frame, from without as well. Every ground floor window sealed. They were inside a building designed to hold against people who wanted out. And then the phone rang, from the kitchen, a sound she hadn't expected, the double ring of a rotary telephone, mechanical and insistent. She walked to the kitchen doorway. On the wall beside the pantry, a pale green rotary phone, vintage plastic, connected by a thin wire to the same solar converter that was keeping the cassette player alive. The green indicator light on the converter was steady and functional, enough power for a telephone and a cassette player, enough to maintain two specific lines of communication. Her mother had thought of this too. She lifted the receiver, pressed the speaker button on the side of the handset, held it so Ryan, crossing the kitchen behind her, could hear. The voice that came through was male. New England inflection, coastal Maine, the compressed vowels of a specific region and generation. 40 years of that particular climate in the way words were shaped. Smarter than I figured, the voice said. George always said Carol knew how to pick people when it mattered. She did not respond immediately. Let the silence sit. You locked us in, Jessica said, even, measured. The classroom voice, which was the voice she used when she needed to stay in control of a room. After I confirmed the lawyer had sent the right people, a pause. Your lawyer called me. Or more precisely, I gave him a reason to. Jeffrey made a choice that minimized his risk. He's consistent that way. You've been watching since we arrived. Long enough to be certain. Ryan stood beside her without speaking. His hands were at his sides. His face had the contained focus of someone doing structural math in real time. Tell me who you are, she said. The pause before the answer was not long, but it had a quality of something being decided. Brandon Voss, flat, without decoration or apology. Carol was my mother, George White was my father. Same father as you and your brother. She left me when I was 2. I stayed with George. The cadence of someone reciting a fact they've recited so many times that the emotional content has been worn away by repetition. I'm not calling about that. What are you calling about? The ledger. His voice had shifted. Not harder, but more specific. Targeted. She took it when she ran. Master accounting record of every transaction, every account, every arrangement from 1985 through March of '89. She took it, and she took the cash, and she disappeared. And everything went sideways in the year after, because the backup documentation didn't exist. What do you want with it now? George is dead. George built relationships that outlast him. Some of those accounts are still active. Some of those names are still alive and still useful. The ledger is a key to things that belong to his estate, not embellishing. Describing a business problem, which means they belong to me. Ryan looked at her, a look that communicated without needing words. Do not tell him we found it. We haven't found a ledger, she said. We found money and identification documents. The ledger isn't surface level. Carol wouldn't have left it accessible. No frustration in the voice, just certainty. It's there. She built this house around protecting it. The cash is incidental. She looked at the cassette tape still in her jacket pocket, the one from the velvet box upstairs. The tape she hadn't yet played, and if we find it and give it to you, you open the front door, and you walk out. Both of you. Tonight, Ryan shook his head once. A single clear motion. She was already past that question, working the next layer. Not whether to give it, but where the ledger was and how much time existed before it didn't matter. Give us 20 minutes, she said. You have 20. A pause. I've been patient since March. I'm running out of it. She set the receiver face up on the kitchen counter, the line open and live, and went back to the filing cabinets. Because the false bottom of the ammunition box upstairs still hadn't been checked. Because her mother had left 2 copies of the same cassette tape. One visible immediately on the table downstairs. One buried under everything else in the velvet box. Because when you stopped ringing. Because when you spent 30 years planning for the worst possible version of every scenario, you made 2 copies of the things that mattered and you hid them at different depths for different versions of the person who might need to find them. The false bottom of the ammunition box yielded to the key from the manila envelope. Thin enough shaft pressed into the interior seam, leveraged down, with a sound like a knuckle popping, and revealed a compartment 3 centimeters deep running the full width of the box's interior, a black leather notebook, small, soft at the corners from handling, bound with a thin leather cord, tied in a square knot, no label. She untied it, opened it. Page 1. Her mother's handwriting, compressed and precise. Account numbers. Names in abbreviated code. Dates beginning January 1985 and proceeding with the regularity of someone documenting an ongoing operation. She turned to page 44. Different information here. Not accounts. Names. Full names, first and last, followed by dates, amounts, and designations. USDC Me, FJ1, FG2, AAG, United States District Court, Main District, Federal Judges, numbered. Assistant Attorney General. 2 federal judges and an assistant attorney general of the United States. Names and payment records, 11 transactions across 2 years, amounts that required a second count to believe. This was why Sandra Anderson had not walked into an FBI field office in 35 years and handed over the cash and the passports and asked for help. Not because she was guilty, though she had been complicit in things that would have required years to untangle, because the people she would have had to trust were in these pages, because the judges who would have heard any case she brought were in these pages, because she had spent 35 years in the particular paralysis of knowing exactly what had happened and having no safe direction to fall. 12 minutes, Brandon's voice came from the kitchen counter. She retied the cord, put the notebook in the inside pocket of her jacket with the letters, zipped the pocket. Ryan appeared in the doorway. He had been searching the second empty room and found nothing, and his expression said he already knew she'd found it and was reading her next move. "We can't give it to him," Jessica said. "I know. The minute we do, we lose the only thing keeping us worth keeping alive. I know." He looked at the sealed window, at the wardrobe, at the floor. There has to be another way out. She built this place. She thought about everything else, because the woman who had wired a solar panel to keep a cassette player charged, who had left letters in a filing cabinet for a child who would never read them, who had maintained 2 financial lives and 3 identities for 3 decades. That woman did not build a room with 1 exit. She built it knowing what happened when the only exit was controlled by someone else. The wardrobe had been moved many times, not to access the floorboards. The floorboards were in the center of the room, accessible without moving the wardrobe at all. The wardrobe had been moved for something behind it. The wardrobe weighed more than it should have. Not heavy with clothing or storage, empty, she already knew it was empty. But heavy the way things are heavy when they are built to stay put. The wood was dense hardwood, old growth, the kind of construction that predated the era of furniture, assembled from particle board and optimism. Ryan got his shoulder into the left side and Jessica pushed from the right, and for 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all, and then the wardrobe moved a ½ inch, and the scratch marks on the floor deepened by exactly that measure, and the physics shifted. Again, Jessica said. They pushed. The wardrobe groaned against the floorboards, a long, low sound like something reluctant, and slid, 2 inches, 6, a foot. The wall behind it came into view in a narrow strip at first, and then wider, and then fully visible, and what was behind the wardrobe was not a wall, it was a door, not a large door, roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, a hatch, really, built into the wall at floor level, framed in the same fieldstone and wood construction as the rest of the house, but with a steel surround welded to the frame and a steel panel for the door itself. The hinge was on the right side. The latch was a simple iron bar drop lock, the kind that secured from inside by lifting and from outside by a key. The inside latch was the only one that mattered right now. Jessica crouched and lifted the bar. It moved without resistance. Recently oiled, the mechanism smooth in a way that nothing else in this house was smooth, as though someone had maintained this single hatch, specifically against the possibility of needing it quickly. The panel swung outward on well-maintained hinges. Silent beyond it, darkness, a slight downward slope, and the smell of cold earth and pine roots. 10 minutes, Brandon's voice floated from the kitchen, through the floor, up the stairs, the telephone speaker carrying it through the house with the indifferent thoroughness of acoustics. Jessica looked at Ryan. He looked at the hatch. He looked at her jacket pocket where the notebook was, and the letters, and the cassette tape they hadn't yet played. "You first," she said. Ryan went through without discussion, because he was the kind of person who understood that argument was its own form of delay. He angled himself through the hatch on hands and knees, his flashlight beam cutting into the dark below. His voice came back up hollow and slightly muffled. "It opens up. There's room to move." Jessica took one look back at the room. The open ammunition box on the iron cot, the false bottom sprung, the money still in its bundles exactly as her mother had left it. $160,000 that had been the operational budget for a new identity, kept as reserve against the day the identity might fail. She left it. She went through the hatch and pulled the steel panel shut behind her. The passage was not an escape tunnel in the way that phrase implies something engineered and deliberate. It was more modest than that, a crawl space that ran along the inside of the foundation wall, following the stone, with enough height to move through on hands and knees, and enough width for one person at a time. The floor was packed earth, cold and faintly damp. The ceiling was the underside of the ground floor, its joists passing overhead at irregular intervals. The smell was specific and ancient, soil that had been compressed and sealed and had developed its own mineral character over decades. Her flashlight beam found Ryan 8 feet ahead. He was moving without stopping, which meant he'd found a direction that worked. The passage turned once, sharply, following the foundation corner. Then it ran straight for roughly 30 feet. At the end, a second hatch, this one horizontal, set into what felt like the underside of an exterior structure, a small addition or storage unit attached to the back of the house. Ryan was already pushing it upward when she reached him. It resisted for a moment, soil compression from above, and then gave, and cold air poured in with the particular force of outside temperature meeting enclosed space. He pushed through. She followed. They came out under the raised floor of a small woodshed attached to the farmhouse's rear foundation, maybe 10 by 12 feet, its walls partially rotted, but its roof intact. The shed was empty of wood. It had been empty long enough for the floor to accumulate the same deep layer of undisturbed material as the rest of the property. But the shed had a door, and the door was not steel. It was ordinary weathered wood planks on a standard hinge, and it opened outward with the reluctance of swollen wood in cold air. Not from locks. Ryan put his shoulder into it. The door swung out the forest. Hemlock trees close on 3 sides. The late afternoon light coming down at the angle of early evening, maybe 5:30, 5:45. The air was cold enough that their breath made vapor. The house was behind them to the left, visible at about 40 yards through the trees. The smell of gasoline reached her before she heard anything else. Not the ambient smell of fuel from a vehicle. Specific and immediate and directional. Coming from the front of the house, sharp enough to catch in the back of the throat. She grabbed Ryan's sleeve. They moved deeper into the hemlock cover, away from the shed, putting the bulk of the tree trunks between themselves and any line of sight from the front approach. The packed needle carpet under the trees muffled their footsteps. They moved bent low, quickly, not running. Running made noise and displaced branches. Moving the way you move when you understand that being seen is the variable that changes every outcome. 50 yards into the trees they stopped. Pressed their backs against a hemlock trunk, wide enough that both of them fit behind it with margin. Through the gap between trunks, looking back toward the farmhouse, at the angle that showed the front gravel clearing, Jessica saw him, a man standing at the edge of the drive, between the tree line and the front corner of the house. His back was mostly to them. Tall, broad through the shoulders, the build of someone who worked physically and consistently. A red plastic fuel can in his right hand, the kind sold at every hardware store in New England. His left hand held a phone, and he was looking at it with the fixed attention of someone waiting for a response that wasn't coming. He set the phone in his jacket pocket. He walked to the front corner of the house and began to pour. The sound of liquid against the dark wood siding. The gasoline smell expanding in the cold air, growing from directional to atmospheric. Ryan's hand found Jessica's arm and closed around it. Brandon poured along the front wall, moving methodically, covering ground with the efficiency of someone executing a step in a plan rather than making a decision in the moment. He'd known the ledger was in the house. He'd known the front door would hold against them. He'd planned for the possibility that they would refuse to cooperate and had prepared accordingly. He had always planned to burn it. The ledger, the filing cabinets, the corkboard, the letters, the cassette tapes. Every document her mother had spent 35 years protecting. If it burned, the protection ended permanently. If Jessica and Ryan were inside, no investigation would begin with the assumption that anything of significance had been inside the building with them. A farmhouse fire in a remote area with no nearby witnesses, 2 victims, and no immediately obvious criminal complexity. George White was dead. Brandon Voss would be in another state before the smoke cleared, except they were not inside. They were 40 yards away in the trees, breathing cold air, watching, and the notebook was in Jessica's jacket pocket. Brandon moved to the side wall. Poured, moved again. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would have added anything to what they were watching, and any sound in the still forest carried. He circled back to the front, set the fuel can down, took a lighter from his jacket pocket, stood for a moment, looking at the front of the house, with the posture of someone considering something for the last time. Then he crouched and held the lighter to the base of the front wall. The fire didn't explode. It took, the flame moving horizontally along the accelerant line with a sound like a held breath suddenly released. A low whoomp that she felt as much as heard, and then the vertical climb began, orange and fast and hungry, the dry wood of the siding catching and expanding the fire upward in the particular way of structures that have been sealed away from moisture for decades. Brandon stood and stepped back. Watched. He was not looking at the trees. He believed they were inside. Jessica's hand moved to her jacket pocket and pressed it flat against the notebook through the fabric. The leather cord tied in a square knot, the pages dense with handwriting that accounted for things a man in a federal prison had once believed were safely buried. The fire reached the second-floor window line. Brandon watched it for another 2 minutes. Then he picked up the fuel can, empty now by the weight of the way he carried it, and walked to the tree line on the far side of the drive, away from where Jessica and Ryan were standing. He moved without looking back. The sound of a vehicle engine starting, some distance away, on a different approach road she hadn't known existed. The sound faded north. They waited another 10 minutes before either of them moved. The farmhouse consumed itself with the thoroughness of conditions that had been working toward exactly this for 30 years. Dry wood, sealed construction, no sprinkler system, no neighboring structures to constrain the burn. By the time the second floor collapsed inward, the sound of it was audible from their position in the trees. A heavy concussive collapse, followed by the shower of sparks that rose like a momentary second fire in the air above the structure and then dissipated. The hemlock canopy was too high and too cold to catch. The fire stayed architectural, consuming what was there and stopping at the ground. They stood in the trees until the structure fire had become a ruin fire, and then a smoldering, and the darkness had fully arrived, and the cold had moved from uncomfortable to something more insistent. "He thinks we're dead," Ryan said. The first words either of them had spoken since the kitchen. "Yes, which means we have until he finds out otherwise. Or until the fire is reported and an investigation establishes 2 adults entered that property today, and there are no remains." She paused, which could be tonight or could be tomorrow. So tonight. Tonight, she looked at the glowing center of what had been the farmhouse. The corkboard was gone. The filing cabinets were gone. The letters she hadn't taken were gone. The cassette player, the solar converter, the 2 passports, the money, gone. Her mother's 35 years of meticulous preservation reduced to this. The thing that happens when the person who built the preservation is no longer here to maintain it. "We need to get to the county road, and before we go anywhere else, we need to stop at Donna Jackson's." Ryan looked at her. "The woman at the gas station," Jessica said. "The woman my mother called Carol. She told us one thing, what to say to anyone who came asking. She didn't tell us what else she knew." Jessica started moving north through the trees, angling toward the county road from a direction that didn't require them to pass through the clearing. "My mother wired a solar panel to keep a cassette player running. She made 2 copies of the same tape. She left letters in a filing cabinet for a child who could never receive them. She did not rely on one person for one thing. She distributed what she needed distributed." Ryan was quiet for 4 steps. Then, "How long have you been thinking that?" "Since she said she only told us one thing." Jessica ducked a branch. People who only tell you one thing usually have more. The county road was farther than she'd estimated. On foot, in the dark through the hemlock understory with no path, and only the general sense of north-northeast as a guide, it was 40 minutes of careful navigation, and 2 wrong turns against topography that looked different without headlights. They came out of the trees onto the county road pavement, at a point roughly half a mile from the gas station. The road was empty in both directions. The dark was the particular New Hampshire rural dark that people from cities don't anticipate. Absolute, in all directions, the sky giving only the ambient gray of overcast with no moon and no ground light to interrupt it. They walked south along the road's shoulder. A truck came from the north, slowing when the headlights found them. The driver, middle-aged, work jacket, no questions. The courtesy of rural areas, where people appear unexpectedly on empty roads at night, because the alternatives are worse. Stopped and drove them to the gas station without conversation beyond the destination. The store light was on when they pulled in. Donna Jackson was not on her chair outside, which made sense given the hour and the temperature. But the front door opened before Jessica had both feet on the gravel, and the old woman stood in the doorway with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been expecting this particular arrival for a long time, and saw no reason to perform surprise at it. She looked at them, at the dirt on their knees, the scratch on Jessica's left forearm from a root in the dark, the smell of wood smoke that had settled into their clothing, and said, "The farm burned, not a question." "Yes," Jessica said. Donna stepped back from the doorway. They went inside. The store was what it had always been: one long room, shelving units, a refrigerated case along the back wall, a counter with an old register. A door at the back led to a residence. Donna went through that door and came back with a brown paper bag, which she set on the counter without ceremony. "She gave this to me 7 months ago," Donna said. "When she called, my mother called you." She called once. In March, Donna's hands rested on the counter. She said she'd been sick for a while. Said it was progressing. She said, "It's moving faster than I thought it would, and I don't have as much time as I planned for." She asked me to hold this bag. She said, "If my daughter comes down this road, you'll know her. She has my eyes, but she asks more questions. Give her the bag when the time is right." Jessica took the bag. She'd been sick. She'd known she was dying. She'd known it was moving faster than her planning had accounted for, which meant her planning had assumed more time. More time to find a safer way to end this than the way it was ending. Inside the bag, a legal-size envelope, sealed, with Jessica's name written on the front in the handwriting she was learning to read differently now. Not the handwriting of her mother, but the handwriting of Carol Ann Voss, who had been Sandra Anderson for 31 years, and had known, 7 months ago, that the math was running out, and a folded piece of paper separate from the envelope, with a name and a phone number and a 2-word description: Laura Clark. FBI Boston below that in smaller writing. She tried in 2019. I said no, she'll listen if you call her. Jessica opened the envelope outside, standing on the gravel under the gas station's single overhead light, because she needed the air. Ryan stood beside her, close enough that they were sharing warmth without meaning to. The letter was 12 pages, handwritten on yellow legal paper, both sides of each sheet. The handwriting small and compressed and in the way of someone getting the maximum possible information into the space available. 12 pages of Carol Ann Voss explaining herself to the daughter who had grown up asking questions she couldn't answer. The facts she already knew from the documents and the corkboard and the birth certificate were here in their full version. The accountant job in 1983, the gradually increasing scope of what she was recording. The year she understood fully what she was working for. 1987, when she went looking in files, she wasn't supposed to access and found the offshore routing records and understood that the numbers she was keeping led to accounts that had no legitimate origin and no legitimate destination. By then she'd been doing it for 4 years and had a child. The birth of Brandon was in the letter. George White had not been a violent man in the way that some men are violent. Impulsive, hot. He was controlled, and his control extended to the people around him, and the way he loved his son was indistinguishable from the way he owned things. Carol had watched that for 2 years and understood what it meant. The plan to run had taken 3 months to execute. She'd copied the ledger by hand. She'd pulled the emergency cash in small amounts over 8 weeks. She'd built the first identity through a connection she didn't name. She'd arranged a single exit point, a single contact, a single window of time, March 14, 1989. A Tuesday. She'd picked up Brandon from the daycare center at 3 in the afternoon, same as always. She'd driven to a parking garage in Portland where a car was waiting with the box already in the trunk. Her contact was there. The letter identified him only as JL, which Jessica read as Jeffrey Lewis at 31 years younger, and a fraction less compromised by his own history. JL had arranged the car, the route, and the first 2 weeks of accommodation in a Connecticut city where George White had no established contacts. The parking garage, 2 cars, Brandon in her arms, 2 years old, occupied with a plastic toy she'd brought from home, JL standing between the cars. A conversation about the route, about timing, about what happened if George's people were watching the garage exits, and then a vehicle in the garage below. The sound of an engine on the level beneath them. Could be anyone, could be George's JL saying, "The car only has room for 2, you know that. We always said 2. She hadn't known she was pregnant with Ryan. She found out 6 weeks later, which meant it was already decided by the time she knew. She'd been carrying 2 children and only known about one of them when she made the choice in the parking garage. The letter did not excuse this. Carol was not writing to be excused. She was writing because she had run out of time to find a better way to explain it. She had put Brandon down on the back seat of the car she was leaving behind. He was asleep by then. The toy, the motion of the drive, the early afternoon. She had put him down without waking him, and she had gotten into the other car and JL had driven out of the garage while she watched through the rear window until the concrete pillar blocked the sight of the car she'd left him in. She had told herself, George loves his son. George will come for him. George will not harm him. She had been correct about the first two, and wrong about the third in the ways that mattered. The final pages were about the ledger. The book isn't just the accounts. Pages 44 through 51. Look at them carefully. Those names are federal judges and a former DOJ official. 2 are still on the bench. 1 died in 2018. They protected George from full prosecution in 2001. That is why I couldn't go to the FBI in 1989 or 1995 or 2003 or any year after. I didn't know which doors were safe. I still don't, completely. But Laura Clark tried to reach me in 2019, through a channel that told me she'd found her way to this the right way, without touching any of the protected infrastructure. If anyone will handle this correctly, she will. I should have called her back in 2019. I ran out of courage at the wrong moment. I'm sorry for that too. You'll know what to do with it. You always knew what to do with the things I couldn't explain. You just didn't have the information yet. I love you both. That has never been a performance. Ryan had read it over her shoulder, or enough of it. He was looking at the station's overhead light rather than at her, which was the thing he did when he was working out how to carry something new. She was sick since March, he said. She died in September, 6 months. She was managing a terminal diagnosis and a 35-year criminal secret simultaneously, and she didn't say anything to either of us. She was protecting the cover story until she'd found a way to dismantle it safely. Jessica put Laura Clark's number in her jacket pocket. She ran out of time. She ran out of time twice, Ryan said. Once in 1989 and once this year. That was not wrong. The terrible mathematics of it. The first failure compounded by the second, the son left behind in a parking garage, growing into the man who had just set fire to the only physical evidence of why he'd been left, was not something she was going to resolve tonight. Possibly not ever, in the sense of arriving at a place where it felt finished. What she could do was the thing her mother had tried and failed to do twice. The thing that required a specific phone number, and a federal agent who had already done the hard work of approaching this from a clean direction. We need to find a phone with a landline, Jessica said. Or enough signal to make one call, Donna Jackson, from the store doorway. There's a phone inside. Use it. Laura Clark answered on the second ring. It was nearly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night and the FBI special agent's direct line picked up on the second ring, which told Jessica something about the kind of operational mode Clark had been in since George White died, and the case files on the peripheral network came back to active status. Jessica said, "My name is Jessica Davis. My mother was Carol Ann Voss. I have her ledger. She said you'd know what that means." A pause. 3 seconds, which felt much longer. "I know exactly what that means," Laura Clark said. Her voice was controlled, professionally level, with underneath it something that sounded like the specific relief of a person who has been waiting for a phone call for 5 years and had started to accept it might not come. "Where are you right now?" "Dunmore, New Hampshire. A gas station on County Road 14. Are you safe?" "Currently, yes. Brandon Voss burned the farmhouse tonight. He believes we were inside." Another pause. Shorter. "Brandon Voss, confirmation of something she'd already had in a file. You met him. He locked us in the house and gave us an ultimatum. We got out through a passage in the foundation before he lit it. Did he see you leave?" "No. Does he know you're alive?" "Not yet." "Then we have a window." The quality of Clark's voice had shifted from controlled to operational. "I'm going to need you to stay exactly where you are. I'm making 2 calls and then I'm calling you back at this number. Don't contact anyone else in the meantime. Not the local police, not a lawyer, no one. The reason for that is the same reason your mother couldn't come forward for 35 years. Do you understand?" Pages 44 through 51, Jessica said, a third pause. "The longest one, she told you." Something in Clark's voice that might have been grief, or might have been the professional equivalent of grief, which is recognizing that a witness you tried to protect didn't make it to the resolution they were owed. "She left me a letter. 7 months ago, she was sick. Yes, I tried to reach her in 2019. She told me. She said she should have called you back. She said that was a failure of courage at the wrong moment." "It wasn't courage," Clark said quietly, in the voice of someone who'd had 5 years to think about this. It was 35 years of knowing that one wrong move undid everything. She wasn't wrong to be careful. She was just almost out of time by the time she got careful enough. A breath. "Stay where you are. I'll call back in 15 minutes. Clark's 15 minutes were 14 minutes and 40 seconds. "Here's where we are," she said. "Brandon Voss is currently unknown to us, but his vehicle is registered in Massachusetts, and we have a system active for that plate. The farmhouse fire has been called in by a resident approximately 8 miles north who saw the smoke. Local fire response is en route. We have approximately 90 minutes before the site investigation begins to raise questions about the property's history. What do we need to do? Drive to Manchester. The field office is on Elm Street. I'm going to be there in 3 hours. In the meantime, you're going to be met by 2 agents I trust, and trust is not a word I use carelessly in the context of this particular file. Pages 44 through 51, Jessica said again. Yes, Clark paused. The 2 currently sitting judges, there are proceedings in motion, have been since January. They don't know about the ledger yet. They will by tomorrow morning. I've been working this for 4 years without being able to prove what I could see. You just handed me everything I've been missing. My mother tried to hand it to you in 2019. Your mother was trying to protect her children, Clark said. And she did. For 31 years, she did exactly that. A brief silence. Get to Manchester. Don't stop anywhere between here and there. Donna Jackson lent them her car. Not offered it. Lent it specifically with the understanding that they would return it, with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has lived far enough from everything that helping strangers is not unusual. It is just what a person does when the need is in front of them. It was an old Volvo wagon, dark blue, with 160,000 miles on it, and a heat system that took 8 minutes to produce anything noticeable. Ryan drove. Jessica sat with her jacket in her lap, and the notebook and the letter and Laura Clark's number in her hands, and the cassette tape she still hadn't played. She looked at the tape for a long time on the county road, in the dark, with the headlights finding the reflectors on the highway approach signs ahead of them. Only when there is no other choice. She put it in her jacket pocket. There would be time for it. There would be time to sit somewhere warm and press play and hear her mother's voice explaining, in her own measured cadence, the same things the letter had explained in ink. There would be time to sit with that, to let it be the last real conversation they could have. Not tonight. Tonight was for the other thing. They reached the highway on-ramp. Ryan accelerated onto I-89 South. The signal returned to both their phones in stages. First 1 bar, then 2, then full, and neither of them looked at it for a long time. She was always planning, Jessica said. We just didn't know what she was planning for. The highway opened ahead of them. The trees on either side went from the shapes of individual branches in the headlights to an undifferentiated dark mass. The speed of the road made things simple. Temporarily, there was only forward, and the miles counting down in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the space between them with noise. She thought about the hatch behind the wardrobe, the carefully oiled hinge. The passage her mother had built not to hide in but to leave through, when the leaving became necessary. A person who builds a hidden exit into a house they visit 3 times a year is a person who has accepted that the worst possible scenario might eventually occur, and has decided that accepting it is not the same as surrendering to it. The exit sign for Manchester appeared in the distance. 12 miles. She pressed her palm flat against the notebook through the fabric of her pocket. Pages 44 through 51. Her mother had built a house to protect these pages. Brandon Voss had burned the house, believing the pages were inside. The judges named in those pages had sent in it 17 years trusting that the woman who knew about them would stay quiet because she had too much to lose. All 3 of those calculations were about to be wrong at once. The Manchester field office occupied the ground floor of a federal building on Elm Street that had been designed by someone who believed government architecture should communicate solidity rather than welcome. Granite steps, heavy glass doors, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything it touched. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, it was staffed by a skeleton crew and 1 front desk agent who looked up when Jessica and Ryan came through the door with the specific attentiveness of someone who had been told to expect exactly this. She said her name. The agent picked up a phone without asking her to repeat it. 2 minutes later, they were in a room with 2 chairs and a table and a mirror on one wall that was not trying very hard to look like anything other than what it was. The room smelled like institutional coffee and recycled air. Ryan sat down. Jessica did not. She stood near the mirror and looked at the notebook in her hands. The leather cover soft and darkened at the edges. The cord still tied in the square knot her mother had tied, and felt, for the first time since she'd opened the farmhouse door that afternoon, the specific exhaustion of a day that had required everything. The 2 agents who came in were a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both in the particular business casual of people who had been called back to work at an hour when they'd expected to be sleeping. They introduced themselves by last name only, Reyes and Torres, and explained that Laura Clark was 3 hours out by vehicle because she'd been in Boston when she got the call and had declined to wait for the first available flight because the flight would not be faster. They explained that everything said in this room was being recorded with Jessica's consent, and she gave it. Then, she placed the notebook on the table. Reyes opened it and read the first page without touching the edges, using a pen to turn it. She read page 44. She looked at Torres. He looked at the notebook. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and in that moment, Jessica understood the size of what she was putting on the table. Not just as a legal matter, but as the kind of thing that changes the shape of a case that had been running for 2 decades without sufficient evidence to close. There are 2 federal judges currently sitting in the First Circuit, Reyes said carefully, her voice the controlled neutrality of someone managing a reaction that she was not yet in a position to have. And you're telling me these entries refer to payments made to those individuals between 1987 and 1989. My mother kept the books, Jessica said. She recorded what she recorded. I'm telling you what's in the notebook. Did she indicate to you, in the letter, whether she had any corroborating documentation outside this book? The farmhouse had filing cabinets. Dozens of them. Jessica paused. Brandon Voss burned the building tonight. He believed we were inside. Torres wrote something on his notepad. He didn't know you'd gotten out, Torres said. He used gasoline on the exterior walls and lit it and walked away. He had a vehicle on a secondary access road. He drove north. We were in the hemlock trees 40 yards east of the structure. Can you describe the vehicle? Dark exterior. Pickup or SUV, I couldn't determine which from that distance. The engine sound indicated something heavier than a sedan, Torres wrote more. Reyes had not stopped reading the notebook. She was moving through it methodically, page by page, with the pen tracking the entries. When she reached the final pages, she read more slowly, and the pace itself was a kind of response. The letter, Reyes said, not looking up. May I see it? Jessica placed it on the table beside the notebook. The interview that followed was 3.5 hours long. Jessica told it in sequence. The lawyer's office in Hartford, the printed map, Donna Jackson's identification of a woman named Carol, the farmhouse exterior, and the steel door and the plywood windows, the filing cabinets and the corkboard and the letters and the ammunition box, the birth certificate, the phone call, Brandon's voice on a rotary telephone in a kitchen in an empty house, the cassette tape she still hadn't played, the hatch behind the wardrobe and the passage and the woodshed and the cold forest and the fire, and the man standing in the orange light, watching what he believed was his own resolution. Clark listened without interrupting. She asked clarifying questions twice. Once about the specific routing of the passage, and once about the timeline of the phone call, how long between locking the door and lighting the fire. Both times the question had the specificity of someone building a legal framework around the facts, not someone who needed the story explained. The room stayed quiet in the specific way of rooms where important things are being said. Torres kept writing. Reyes kept reading. Jessica kept going because the only thing left to do in this moment was finish telling the truth. Her mother had spent 35 years preparing to tell. Laura Clark arrived at 3:41 in the morning. The drive from Boston was 3 hours and 11 minutes on empty highways at a speed that suggested the calculation had factored in acceptable risk. She came through the door of the interview room without knocking, a detail that registered as someone exercising authority in their own space. And she looked at the notebook and the letter on the table before she looked at Jessica. Then she looked at Jessica, 44 years old, brown hair cut practically short, a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent years maintaining controlled surfaces over active interiors. She wore a fleece over a dress shirt, which was the look of someone who had grabbed the nearest layer when the phone rang. Jessica Davis, she said. The statement of an identification, not a greeting. Yes, Clark sat down across from her. She did not open the notebook immediately. She looked at it for a moment in the way that certain things require a moment before you touch them. Not hesitation, but respect for the weight of the object. The weight of 35 years compacted into 112 pages of careful handwriting. Your mother called herself Sandra Anderson for 31 years, Clark said. I spent 4 years trying to find Carol Ann Voss and couldn't. I found the trail of Sandra Anderson in 2019 through a property tax record that had been filed under a maiden name variant on a different property. She paused, a small inconsistency in a database maintained by the Hartford County Assessor's Office. It took me 14 months to trace it to your mother's address in Meriden. I contacted her through an intermediary, who I was confident had no connection to the protected network. She said she received the contact. I know. She declined to respond. I waited 6 months and tried once more. Same result. Clark's hands rested on the table. I concluded she had either relocated or decided the risk was too high. I held the file open and kept building from a different direction. A pause that contained something. Not quite regret, not exactly. She had her reasons. She had her children, Jessica said. Yes, Clark said it simply. She did. Ryan had been sitting at the end of the table for the full 3.5 hours, saying almost nothing. He looked up now with the expression of a person hearing the last piece of something click into position. Not relief exactly. More like the recognition that the shape of a thing, which had been obscured for a long time, was finally visible. At 6:15 in the morning, Torres came back into the room with a phone and held it toward Clark with an expression that communicated something precise without saying what it was. Clark took the phone, listened for 40 seconds, said, "Where?" Listened again, said, "Contain it. I'm 40 minutes out." Handed the phone back to Torres and looked at Jessica. Brandon Voss was taken into custody at 6:07 this morning at a rest stop on I-93 southbound near Concord, she said. He'd stopped for fuel. State police had the plate from our system alert and made the stop. Jessica looked at Ryan. He looked back at her with the expression of someone hearing a piece of information settle into place. The specific settling of a weight that had been held at tension since the moment the deadbolt engaged on the farmhouse door. "Timothy Harris," Jessica said. Clark's attention sharpened. "Where did you hear that name?" Brandon mentioned it on the phone. He said Jeffrey Lewis's son was being held somewhere. He implied that was the mechanism he used to compel Jeffrey to send us to the farmhouse. "We've had Timothy Harris flagged as a missing person since Friday," Clark said. His father reported him missing while Brandon was actively using Timothy's location as leverage. Jeffrey Lewis reported his own son missing, while knowing exactly why he was missing, and choosing the path that kept his own hands technically clean, she stood. "We're speaking with him this morning." She picked up the notebook, carefully, with the particular care of something long searched for, and held it with both hands. "I need to go to Concord. The 2 agents who've been here with you are going to stay with you for now. There's a room with a couch and a door that closes. You've been awake for approximately 22 hours. Jessica looked at the notebook in Clark's hands. "She should have been the one to give it to you," she said. Clark looked at her with an expression that was not pity and not sympathy, but something more specific. The look of a person who had spent years in proximity to the worst things people did to each other, and had not lost the capacity to be affected by what it cost the ones who had no part in it. "No," Clark said. "She got it here. That's what she needed to do, and she did it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Your mother built the whole thing around this notebook. 35 years of everything she did to keep this intact and get it to someone who could use it correctly. She made a choice in a parking garage in Portland in 1989, and then spent the next 35 years doing the only thing available to her, which was making sure that choice eventually meant something beyond its own damage." She looked at the notebook in her hands one more time. "Sleep. I'll be back by afternoon." The couch in the side room was a government-issue, 2-cushion thing that had presumably been chosen for durability rather than comfort. But Jessica was past the point where that distinction mattered. She was asleep within 4 minutes of lying down, the full weight of 22 hours of continuous adrenaline finally discharged, and she slept without dreaming, in the deep undisturbed way of a body that has finished something and shut itself down to recover. She woke at 12:47 in the afternoon to the sound of Ryan's voice in the hallway and bright October daylight through the one window of the small room, the same quality of light as the day before. Clear, cold, the particular clarity of New Hampshire in mid-October, when the air has nothing in it but itself. Ryan came in with 2 paper cups of coffee that were not good but were hot. He sat in the plastic chair across from the couch and handed her one. "Clark called from Concord," he said. "Timothy Harris was released at 10 this morning. He was in a rental cabin in Ludlow, Vermont, 40 miles from the farmhouse. Whoever was with him left sometime after midnight, which is roughly when Brandon was driving south. When Brandon thought he was clear," Jessica said. "When Brandon thought the only people who knew about Timothy Harris had died in a fire in New Hampshire," Ryan wrapped both hands around his cup. Jeffrey Lewis is being formally charged this afternoon. Conspiracy and obstruction. His lawyer is already negotiating a cooperation agreement. He'll give them Brandon. He already has given them Brandon. Apparently he became very talkative within 20 minutes of being read his rights. Jessica thought about the man in the office on Trumbull Street, the silver hair and the careful voice and the one-beat pause before the answer. A man who had known Sandra Anderson's real name for 35 years and kept it, which was its own complicity, and who had finally been offered a way to end the keeping at the cost of 2 people he'd never met. She did not feel sorry for him. She also did not feel the clean satisfaction of a verdict, because nothing about this had the shape of something finished. Clark came back at 2:15. She looked like someone who had been awake for a long time and had decided that was simply the condition she was operating under. She sat across from Jessica at the table in the original interview room, the notebook closed in front of her. Brandon Voss is being charged in the 1st District, she said. Arson in the 1st degree, 2 counts of attempted homicide, 1 count of criminal restraint, 1 count of extortion. There will be additional charges as the investigation develops. The 2 judges, Jessica said. Clark looked at the notebook. That's a federal matter at a level above my direct jurisdiction, which means I've handed it to people above me who I also trust, and I've been explicit about the chain of custody and the conditions under which it was found. 2 of the named individuals have had their clerks cancel all scheduled appearances this week. The 3rd named individual, the former DOJ official, is in his late 70s and was reached at his home in Arizona this morning for what is being described as a voluntary interview. Voluntary? The kind of voluntary that happens when 2 FBI agents appear on your doorstep at 7 in the morning and use the words material witness. Yes. Clark paused. This is going to take time. The kind of time that federal judicial proceedings take, which is not the same as the kind of time in which things feel resolved. I want to be honest with you about that. My mother waited 35 years, Jessica said. I can wait. The arson case and the charges against Brandon Voss will move faster. Those proceedings are more straightforward. The judicial corruption investigation is complex and slow, and I will not be able to share most of it with you as it develops. What I can tell you is that the evidence is substantial and the notebook is exactly what it appears to be, a contemporaneous record kept by a trained accountant, in detail, over 4 years. It's going to be very difficult to argue away. She was good at her job, Jessica said. There was no pride in it exactly, but something adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of a specific competence exercised over a long time, finally visible for what it was. She was exceptional at her job, Clark said. Both jobs. She looked at Jessica steadily. She raised 2 children in conditions of persistent threat and maintained a cover that held for 31 years. That is not something most people could do, and it cost her in ways that don't show up in any record. A pause. I want you to know that I don't think she was wrong about any of it. She made the best choices she could with what she had, under conditions she didn't choose and couldn't fully escape. Jessica said nothing for a moment. She thought she should have called you back in 2019, she said finally. She was tired, Clark said. She'd been careful for 30 years, and she was tired and she wasn't certain, even then, that I was exactly what I appeared to be. That's not a failure. That's 30 years of having learned not to trust the shape of something without checking the structure. A brief pause. She checked eventually. She left you my number. That was her checking. They drove back to Dunmore that afternoon in a federal vehicle with Torres and Reyes, because Donna Jackson's Volvo needed to be returned, and because Clark wanted a preliminary assessment of the site before the local fire marshal's investigation concluded the wrong things. The farmhouse was what fire leaves of a structure that had been sealed against the world for 3 decades. A blackened foundation, collapsed interior, the stone walls partially standing as the most resistant element, the steel door lying in the ruin of the front entry, at an angle that made it look like a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. The hemlock trees were untouched, their canopy too high and too cold to have caught. The clearing smelled of ash and something mineral, the particular aftermath of stone that has been heated and cooled again. Jessica stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. The filing cabinets were gone. They had burned or collapsed, the steel warped and commingled with everything else into something that was no longer cabinet-shaped. The corkboard was gone, the newspaper clippings and photographs and red string reduced to carbon. The letters she had not taken were gone. The cassette player was gone. The money she had left on the iron cot was gone, incinerated along with everything it represented. The operational budget of a new identity that had survived 30 years past its intended purpose. She had taken what she needed. The notebook was with Laura Clark. The letter and the 5 letters to Owen were in her jacket pocket. The cassette tape was in the other pocket. Ryan stood beside her, not saying anything. Sometimes the right response to something is the acknowledgement that the thing is too large for commentary, and the only honest answer is to stand in front of it. Torres and Reyes moved through the site professionally, photographing and noting. The local fire marshal's preliminary report had already identified accelerant use, which meant the site had been classified as a crime scene before Clark arrived, which meant the investigation was already properly framed. After a while, Jessica walked back to Donna Jackson's store. The old woman was on her chair outside when Jessica arrived, which seemed, at this point, less like coincidence, and more like a commitment to a particular position in the world. The afternoon light was going already, the October sun dropping fast, the temperature beginning its rapid descent toward evening. The farm's gone, Donna said. Not asking, yes, was it Brandon? Jessica looked at her. You knew his name, Carol told me, the first time she came, in '92. She said she had a boy she'd left behind. Said his name was Owen, but his father would have renamed him by now, and she didn't know to what. Donna's hands were in her lap, completely still. She said if anything ever happened to the farm, it would either be the person she was running from or the child she'd left. She said both were the same kind of danger, which I never quite understood until just now. Brandon, Jessica said. His father named him Brandon. Donna nodded once. The nod of someone filing something in a place they'd had prepared for it. Is he alive? Donna said. Carol's boy. In custody, Jessica said. Yes, good. A pause. That's better than the other thing, even if it's not the thing anyone wanted. Jessica sat down on the step below the chair. The cold of the concrete came through her jeans. The distant smell of ash from the clearing half a mile away was still faintly present in the still air. She was sick, Jessica said. She knew she was dying when she called you in March. She didn't say that exactly. She said, I'm running out of time for this to resolve the way I wanted it to. She said, I need someone to hold something for me, someone who isn't in the system, someone who has no reason to be involved except that they have a good front porch and a memory for faces. She trusted you. She trusted the distance, Donna said. I was the most neutral person in her radius. That's a specific kind of useful. A pause. But we also talked, the 3 times she came. She sat in that store for an hour each time, and we talked about nothing in particular, the way you do with someone you can't actually talk to about anything real. It adds up to something. Over the years, the October light was doing what it did at this hour in this region, going sideways and gold and then quickly to gray. The hemlock trees down the road held their shapes against the darkening sky. She loved you, Donna said. Both of you. She talked about you and your brother the way a person talks about the things they built that they're most proud of. Not in the words people use when they're trying to say something. In the way they say the ordinary stuff. She mentioned what grade you were teaching, what kind of electrical work your brother was doing. The ordinary specifics, a pause. That's where love actually lives in most people. Not in the declarations, in the casual mentions, in the way someone's name comes up in the middle of a sentence about something else. Jessica did not say anything for a moment. The distinction Donna was drawing between the declarative form of love and the form that lives in the texture of ordinary mention was one she recognized, and recognizing it did something she hadn't expected, which was that it made the loss shift slightly, not smaller, just differently shaped. Less like a wall and more like ground. Thank you, Jessica said, for keeping the bag. It was a bag in a drawer for 7 months, Donna said. Not a hardship. They drove back to Hartford that evening in the federal vehicle, and then Reyes drove them to Meriden in a separate car, because Jessica had asked if they could stop at the house before they went anywhere else. The house that had been Sandra Anderson's, and that was now, on paper, half hers and half Ryan's, and that felt when she put her key in the front door, like the most ordinary and the most unbearable thing simultaneously. The house was exactly as it had been the last time she'd been here, 2 weeks before her mother died. The particular organized stillness of a home maintained by someone who knew their way around a space. The kitchen counter clear, the dish rack empty and stored. The small table by the front window with the ceramic bowl her mother kept her keys in, the keys still in it, because the person who owned them had not come back for them. Ryan sat down in the kitchen. Jessica stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the 2 photographs on the shelf by the window. Both taken after she was born. Both taken after Brandon was already growing up somewhere without his mother. In the first, Sandra Anderson was holding a baby that was Ryan, and she was looking at the camera with an expression that was composed and direct, and something else. Something in the eyes that Jessica was only now able to read correctly, which was the look of a person who has recently done something they cannot undo, and has decided to build the best possible version of what remains. In the second photograph, both children were in the frame. Ryan was 3, sitting on the porch steps. Jessica was a baby, not yet walking. Sandra Anderson was kneeling behind them with one hand on each child's shoulder, and she was not looking at the camera. She was looking at her children, and the expression on her face was the one that Donna Jackson had described. Not a declarative, not a performed sentiment, but the look of someone watching the thing they were most responsible for in the world, and finding it sufficient. Finding it, in spite of everything, worth what it had cost. Jessica took the photograph off the shelf and sat down on the couch with it. She sat there for a while. She did not cry, not then, not in the way that comes with immediate grief, because what she was feeling was not exactly grief anymore. It was something more complex. The grief still present but mixed now with understanding, with context, with the particular sensation of a picture that had been blurry for 31 years suddenly resolving. The woman in the photograph was still her mother, but she was also Carol Ann Voss, who had been 26 years old in a Portland parking garage, making a choice that no available option made easy, and who had carried the weight of that choice every day from then until September, when she had fallen forward in her garden and not gotten up again. She had kept going. That was the fundamental fact of it. Under conditions that would have broken the structure from people's lives, she had kept going and built something that worked, that was real, that had produced 2 adults who were functional and present and capable of handling the worst week of their lives without fracturing. She had done that while carrying a secret that would have destroyed the ordinary life she'd built if it had ever surfaced prematurely. And she had done it alone, which was perhaps the most exhausting part. The specific solitude of knowing a thing that cannot be shared. You live with a secret long enough, it stops being a secret and starts being architecture. The thing your whole life is built around, invisible from the outside, load-bearing in ways that nothing else can be. When the architecture finally comes down, as it had come down last night in a New Hampshire clearing, what's left is not rubble exactly, it's the foundation, which was always the part that mattered. The cassette tape. She had not played it yet. She was aware of this in the continuous background way she'd been aware of it since she'd first seen it in the velvet box inside the ammunition box. Her mother's handwriting on the label, 6 words she now understood as a specific instruction and not a general one. Not a statement about the conditions under which the tape should be played, but a statement about the conditions that would have been reached by the person who made it this far. Only when there is no other choice meant. Only when you've done everything else. Only when the action has concluded and the evidence is where it belongs, and the people who needed protecting are protected. Only when the only thing left is the conversation itself. She was at that point. She was sitting on her mother's couch in her mother's living room, with the photograph in her lap and the tape in her pocket. And there was nothing left to do tonight except this. Ryan came out of the kitchen and sat in the armchair across from her. He looked at her hands. "You're going to play it," he said. "Yes." He looked around the room, their mother's room, the ceramic bowl with the keys, the rubber plant in the corner that was alive, definitely alive, the way it had always been alive and would presumably continue to be alive, regardless of what happened to the people around it. The stack of paperback novels on the side table with the spines broken in the way that meant they'd been read multiple times. "Play it," he said. The cassette player was in the kitchen drawer, where Sandra Anderson kept the things that didn't have a dedicated place but needed to be findable. A small portable player, batteries included, the kind bought for exactly this kind of situation by a woman who had thought of every situation. The tape seeded and clicked, and there was a brief hiss of magnetic oxide before the voice began. Her mother's voice. Not the voice on the phone or the voice of memory specifically, but the voice as it actually was. Measured, slightly low. The Hartford accent she'd had all her life. The particular compression of her consonants that Jessica had been hearing since, before she could form words herself. Jessica. Ryan. You're listening to this, then the thing I was most afraid of has happened, and the thing I most hoped for has also happened, which means you found the house, and you got out of it with the notebook, and you're somewhere safe. Those 2 things go together. Getting out with the notebook was the only version of this that mattered. So if you're listening, you did it. I need you to know that I know that. A pause in which breath was audible. The small human sound of someone steadying themselves before continuing. I have a lot to tell you that I'm also telling you in the letter, because I didn't know which you'd find first, and I didn't want to trust everything to one format. What I want to say here, in this version, is the part that's harder to write. The part that belongs in a voice rather than a sentence on paper. I never stopped knowing that Brandon existed. I want to say that clearly. I never had a morning where I didn't know he was somewhere, growing up, becoming a person I wasn't there to see. I thought about him the way you think about a wound that healed wrong. Not constantly, because you can't live that way, but every time something reminded me of the shape of what I'd done. His age was always present. When he turned 10, I knew it. When he turned 18, when George was first arrested in 2001, I checked every news report to see if Brandon was mentioned, and when he wasn't, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. Her voice maintained its measured quality. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this, not to make it smooth but to make it possible. To have practiced the sentences enough times that they could be said without stopping. I couldn't go back for him. That's the truth I've had to live inside. Not that I didn't want to, not that I didn't think about it in the early years when he was small enough that I could have invented a story and made it work. The truth is that going back for him meant going back to George's radius. And I had 2 other children, and the probability calculation never resolved in a direction that allowed it. I was not brave enough. That's also a truth. I could have been braver and I wasn't, and I don't know how to ask forgiveness for it, because I'm not certain I would have done it differently, even knowing what I know now. A longer pause. The hiss of the tape underneath the silence. I want you to know that the letters in the cabinet were real. Every word in them was true. I didn't write them because I thought he'd receive them. I wrote them because he needed to exist for me, in a form that was more than just the weight I carried. If he's alive and he's findable and the situation ever permits, I want him to have those letters. Not as an apology, as a record, as proof that he was not invisible to me, ever, not for a single day. Jessica's hand was on Ryan's arm. She wasn't sure when she'd put it there. He hadn't moved it. I spent 31 years keeping you safe from the thing I'd been part of. I did it in ways that cost you things I know they cost you. The absence of grandparents, the absence of family history, the questions I couldn't answer. You paid for my choices in ways I couldn't compensate for. I'm sorry for that. I am genuinely sorry for the shape of childhood I gave you, the one with the holes in it where ordinary things should have been. But I'm not sorry for keeping you. I'm not sorry for the 31 years. I'm not sorry for any morning I made you breakfast or helped you with homework, or drove you somewhere you needed to go, or sat in a school auditorium watching you in a play. Those things were real. Whatever else was complicated, those things were exactly what they appeared to be. Another pause. When the voice returned, it was slightly different. The quality of someone reaching the end of what they'd prepared, moving into less rehearsed territory. Laura Clark. She's the right person. I should have trusted her in 2019 and I didn't, and I've regretted that. Trust her now. The notebook is the most important thing. More important than the money, more important than anything else in that house. Everything I built around it, the house, the identities, the years of careful, ordinary life. All of it was in service of getting that notebook to someone who could use it correctly. I hope I've gotten it far enough along that you can get it the rest of the way. I love you both. I love you in the way that doesn't require saying because it's present in everything, but I'm saying it anyway, because you should hear it in my voice at least once, without any of the other things. In the way, the tape ran on for a few seconds of silence, and then the mechanical click of the end of the spool, and then nothing. Neither of them spoke for a while. The kitchen clock ticked. The rubber plant did whatever rubber plants do in the dark. Outside, the neighborhood made its ordinary nighttime sounds. A car on the street, a dog 2 houses down, the distant hum of the highway that ran north of Meriden toward Hartford. Ryan was the one who spoke first, eventually. She said she loved us the way that doesn't require saying. His voice was carefully even, and then she said it anyway. Yes, Jessica said, because she knew we might need to hear it, specifically. In her voice, yes. He was quiet for another moment. Then, she was right that we needed to hear it. Jessica rewound the tape. Not to play it again, just to have it at the beginning, in case there was ever a time when one of them needed to hear it again. And having to rewind it themselves in that moment was one too many steps. She put it back in the cassette player, and put the cassette player on the shelf beside the two photographs. It belonged there, more than anywhere else she could think of. The weeks that followed had the texture of aftermath. Not the dramatic continuation of the event itself, but the slower, less cinematic work of consequence. The Brandon Voss arraignment was in federal court in Concord. The charges as filed included 2 counts of attempted homicide, arson in the first degree, criminal restraint, extortion, and possession of an illegal firearm. His attorney filed a motion to suppress the phone call from Farmhouse on Fourth Amendment grounds that the federal judge denied inside 48 hours. Jeffrey Lewis entered a cooperation agreement. The terms were not public, but the outcome of the cooperation was, eventually, visible. A series of sealed federal proceedings involving 2 sitting federal judges in the First Circuit. Proceedings that generated the kind of news coverage that is at first denied and then slowly confirmed as the sources multiply and the denials become structurally incoherent. Both judges placed themselves on administrative leave in the same week, citing different reasons, before the formal proceedings against them were unsealed. One hired 3 attorneys in 6 days, which is the legal equivalent of a thermostat reading. The former DOJ official, 78 years old and living in Scottsdale, Arizona, died of a cardiac event 4 weeks after his voluntary interview. Whether the interview contributed to the event was not a question that anyone in the official investigation appeared eager to determine. He had been the largest single recipient in the notebook's pages, and his death closed a specific evidentiary thread in ways that complicated certain aspects of the prosecution and simplified others. Timothy Harris was found physically unharmed. He had been held in a rental cabin in Vermont for 12 days with access to food and heat and a locked door, and when the door opened, he had walked out with the specific blinking adjustment of someone stepping from one reality into another. He did not press separate charges. His father, in the cooperation agreement, had already attributed sufficient culpability to Brandon Voss for the restraint charges to hold without Timothy's testimony, and Timothy, for reasons he didn't explain to anyone who asked, declined to add to what was already substantial. Jessica understood that instinct in theory, about the choice to not press, about whether it was fear or something more considered, the recognition that there was enough already, and that adding his voice to it was not the thing that would make it more resolved. She went back to teaching in November, 2 weeks after the Manchester field office visit, and 4 weeks after her mother had fallen in the garden. The classroom had been covered by a substitute who had done a creditable job with the unit on multiplication and a less creditable job with the transition to fractions. And so Jessica spent 3 days recovering the fractions before they could move forward, which was fine, because coming back to something concrete that needed doing was its own form of steadying. The 22 children in her class did not know anything about any of it. They knew she'd been away because someone in her family had died, and they had made her a card. The kind where everyone signs, the signatures are in different sizes, depending on the age to motor skill correlation, and presented it to her on her first day back, with the solemnity of children who have been coached about grief by a well-meaning substitute, and are applying the coaching with full effort. She had thanked them with the appropriate weight, and then started on fractions, and the norm result of it had been exactly what she needed. She sent the letters in November. Brandon Voss was in federal holding in Concord pending trial, which gave her a specific address. She had held the 5 letters since October, folded in her jacket pocket through the farmhouse visit and the FBI interview and the drive back to Meriden, and she had moved them to a drawer in her apartment in Providence, and looked at the drawer occasionally and not opened it, because she had not yet figured out what she was doing with them. What she eventually decided was that she was not the right person to decide. The letters were not hers. They had been written by her mother to her brother, and the fact that neither of those people had chosen this method of delivery was not a reason to withhold them from the only remaining recipient. She was a custodian, not a judge. Her job was to complete the delivery. She put the 5 letters in a fresh envelope with no note of her own. Her return address in the upper left corner, his name in the center. She did not know what he would do with them, or how he would receive them, or whether they would mean anything at all to a man who had spent 37 years building an identity out of the materials of having been left. She had no way to predict that, and no authority to manage it. She put a stamp on the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox on the corner on a Tuesday morning before school. She did not expect a response in any particular time frame. She had not attached conditions to the sending. 6 weeks later, in mid-December, there was an envelope in her Providence mailbox, with a Concord postmark and handwriting she didn't recognize. She stood on the front step of her building in the cold and held it for a moment before going inside. The letter inside was one page. The handwriting was careful in the way of someone who did not write letters often and was approaching this one with specific effort. It said, "I read them. I don't know what I'm supposed to say about them. I don't know if there's a right response to finding out you were not as invisible as you thought you were. I'm going to have to think about it for a while. Thank you for sending them." It was signed, Brandon, not a resolution, not a beginning, exactly. Something more like an acknowledgement, the recognition, between two people who shared a mother and a circumstance and nothing else, that the other person existed, and the existence was real, and the situation was complicated enough that neither of them needed to pretend it wasn't. Jessica read it twice, folded it along its original crease, put it in the drawer with the empty cassette case. His Laura Clark called in January to tell her that the First Circuit proceedings were moving forward and that she could not share details, but wanted Jessica to know that the notebook was doing exactly what it needed to do in the hands of the people who now had it. She also said, and this was not standard, Clark acknowledged it was not standard, that she had included Carol Ann Voss's name in the formal case file as a cooperating witness, posthumously, with a notation about the conditions under which the evidence had been preserved. It was the closest the bureaucratic record could come to saying, this person mattered. What she did mattered. The 35 years of holding on mattered. She would have hated the paperwork, Jessica said. Clark made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. She would have organized it better than we did, she said. Based on what I saw of her filing system. Jessica looked out the window of her apartment at the Providence winter, the gray light, the bare trees against the pale sky. Thank you, she said, for holding the file open, for not closing it after 2019. It was the right case, Clark said simply. You close the right cases when they're finished, not when they get hard. The call lasted another 10 minutes on procedural details, and then ended the way most conversations with federal agents ended, which was briskly and without the kind of warmth that comes from having time for warmth. Jessica set her phone on the windowsill, outside a city moving through an ordinary Tuesday in January. People going places, cars. The particular gray-blue light of New England winter afternoon, which was not beautiful in the way of other seasons, but which had its own quality, honest, unadorned, the landscape stripped to its essential elements. Her mother had lived in this kind of light for 31 years, had taught school in it, raised children in it, maintained a parallel life inside it, held everything together from the inside, in ways that showed nothing from the outside. Had done all of that until September, when the aneurysm had ended the question of how long. What she had instead of resolved answers was this: a classroom of 22 children who were going to figure out fractions by the end of the month. A brother who drove down from New Haven sometimes on Sundays and sat in the kitchen of the Meriden house, which they were not yet ready to sell. A drawer with a cassette case and a letter in handwriting she didn't recognize. A photograph on the shelf in that kitchen, both of them small, their mother kneeling behind them, looking not at the camera but at her children, with the expression that Donna Jackson had correctly identified as the place where the real thing lived. An ordinary life, built on a foundation that had been harder than anyone knew. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, most of everything. She went back to the desk. The fractions were not going to teach themselves. 22 children were going to walk through the door tomorrow morning and sit down in front of a problem they didn't yet know how to solve. And her job was to give them the tools to solve it, one careful step at a time, until the thing that had seemed impossible became the thing they could do without thinking. She thought her mother would have understood that impulse exactly.